AMD's RX 470 4GB, is it still a great budget GPU in 2023? The answer to that is yes. Spoiler alert. Before I get into the video, do you have an RX 470 in your gaming PC? And if you do, let me know how it's performing for you. I tested the RX 470 a couple of years ago and I believe it was a Strix model, but since then I've changed a lot of my benchmarking methodology and hopefully the quality of my videos are a lot better now than what they were compared to a couple of years ago. But the RX 470 performed pretty well, and that is thanks to its 2048 shading units and 4 or 8GB of video memory depending on what SKU you went with. This is the 4GB that I'm testing today, and it is the MSI Gaming X, and this cooler, let me tell you now, it is so overbuilt for the RX 470. It stayed around about 50 degrees under load, and this was with an overclock applied as well. So the Gaming X version of the RX 470, you can't go wrong with it. Back in 2016, the RX 470 was a great choice for gamers looking to play at 1080p with relatively modest settings, so that's medium to high, maybe ultra in some games as well, with around 60 FPS for the average frame rate. So back in 2016, this card was literally a godsend. But nowadays, a used RX 470 4GB will set you back around £60 to £70 depending on the model. I paid £50 flat for this RX 470 MSI Gaming, and it did require a bit of cleaning beforehand. The fans that it come with weren't original fans, but luckily I had a broken MSI armour lying around, so I took the fans from that and they worked perfectly fine. The cooler was also pretty oxidised as well, which I've managed to clean up mostly with a lot of multi-purpose spray, which took quite a while, which I did document in a TikTok not too long ago. But I did manage to get it cleaned up quite well, and it cooled just fine with 50 degrees C with an overclock, so yeah, this cooler is performing pretty well. So because of these factors, it did go for pretty cheap, but I tested it out in a previous video. I think it was the buying a used GPU guide, but it worked just fine, and I've pushed the memory and I've pushed the core, and it still has plenty of life left in it. All benchmarking today is done at 1080p, as I wouldn't go any higher than 1080p, especially with the 4GB version, so 1080p is your best bet here. And FSR has been enabled in a few games, but I'll say which games I'm enabled in. I've also overclocked this graphics card, as I think overclocking, especially these Polaris cards, is very easy. It took me about 10 minutes and I got 1350 out of the core and I got 1850 out of the memory as well, so it was a pretty substantial jump, and this was stable after hours of gaming. And an overclock on an older graphics card like this is certainly not a bad idea, especially in 2023, as the RX 470 will need every helping hand it can get to perform just that well. And all testing today is done on my test bench system, which is a Ryzen 5 5600G, 16GB of CL17 3600MHz DDR4 running in dual channel, a Sabrent 1TB NVMe Gen 3 SSD, and an Acer Strix B550-F gaming. You can find the links to these down in the description below. They are Amazon affiliate links, so I make a small commission if you buy anything from them, but this is at no extra cost to you. On superposition on the 1080p medium preset, which is probably the best for this graphics card if I'm honest, it got 7785, which is fairly similar to the RX 570 overclock score. I'll put that on the screen now too. First of the gaming benchmark today is F122, and setting the medium preset here, which I think is probably the best for the RX 470, it got 101 FPS on average with 77 FPS for the 1% low. If you're looking for more of a 144Hz experience, maybe set it to low or even the very low, keep the textures on high perhaps, and you'll be getting a relatively great gaming performance here. Do note I do test on the West Australian GP benchmark, so this is sort of a worst case scenario, because if the weather's dry, you'll probably be getting more FPS. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is much more harder to run than F122, but here we set it to the minimum preset with normal textures to make the game look a little less muddy, and FSR onto quality. This makes the game look pretty okay in my opinion. This got 100 FPS on average with 68 FPS for the 1% low, and I definitely recommend playing at these settings. Maybe if you want a bit more frame rate, set FSR onto balanced. The game will start to look a bit smudged at this point, so yeah, I don't necessarily recommend that, but if you're chasing frame rates, maybe it might be worth an option. Forza Horizon 5 is relatively a great looking game. Even on the low preset it does look pretty decent, and I set FSR here to quality as well. The game wanted to default to medium, but there was significant stutter, so low will have to do for today. This got 78 FPS on average with 66 FPS for the 1% low, and in the in-game benchmark, which is certainly a worst case scenario for this game as it takes place in the city, this is some pretty decent performance here on the RX 470. I just found out that Cyberpunk had a built-in benchmark, so this will allow for much more consistent testing in the future. I set it to the low preset here, and much to my surprise I set the high textures, which didn't even fill up all the 4GB of VRAM, so yeah, that's pretty good. And FSR was on quality as well. Cyberpunk uses FSR 2.1, so FSR on quality here looks pretty good. This got 57 FPS on average with 42 FPS for the 1% low, so performance here very playable if I'm honest. The game doesn't even look that bad if I'm honest, because as long as you've got high textures most games will look pretty decent. So performance in Cyberpunk, certainly not bad at all. In Halo Reach, for once I set it to the enhanced preset because I usually play it on the original, and it's a good job that I did set it to enhanced because it got 189 FPS on average with 124 for the 1% low. I did it in the firefight benchmark as always, and this is a perfect gaming experience at 1080p, especially if you've got a high refresh rate monitor. GTA 5 is so old that high settings here made sense with 2x MSI A2. This got 90 FPS on average with 68 FPS for the 1% low. Very high could certainly be used here as it's got the performance headroom if you're looking for more of a 60Hz experience. God of War is much newer than GTA 5, and because of this we set it to the low preset, and FSR quality was also enabled. This got 85 FPS on average with 74 FPS for the 1% low. If you had the 8GB version of this card, you could definitely crank up them textures a bit, even maybe put it onto original perhaps, and the game would look quite a bit better, but because we've got the 4GB version here, these settings will have to do. Either way though, the game still looked pretty decent, and 85 FPS on average, pretty good if I'm honest. Horizon Zero Dawn is another PlayStation Studios game, and it always tends to run quite a bit better than God of War. With the original preset and FSR on ultra quality here, which has pretty much no effect on the quality at all, but you do get a bit more frame rate, which is what you need in a game sometimes. This got 69 FPS on average, nice, with 53 FPS for the 1% low. Horizon Zero Dawn always tends to play slightly better than God of War, and it does here with the original preset, which looks quite a bit better than the low. So Horizon Zero Dawn is perfectly playable on a 4GB RX 470. In Fortnite I set it to low as I recommend this to get a very high frame rate, and this got 250 FPS on average with 144 FPS for the 1% low. Performance was amazing. I didn't even use the performance API here as I kept it on DirectX 11. If you've got a 360Hz monitor perhaps, the performance API might be a good choice for you, but if you've got 240 or even a 144Hz, DirectX 11 looks a lot better than performance, and this is what I'd recommend. I know Battlefield 5 isn't the newest Battlefield game, but let me know if you want to see 2042 benchmarked, because I've been playing it and I actually think it's pretty decent now if I'm honest. But back to Battlefield 5, and here I set it to the low preset. This got 137 FPS on average and 93 FPS for the 1% low. This was on the Devastation map, which is known to be one of the laggiest maps on this game, but I think these settings and this pairing is perfectly fine for a 144Hz experience. And settings on Battlefield don't scale that well either. There isn't much of a quality loss between low and medium for instance, so set it to the low settings here and you'll be having a great Battlefield experience. Last game up is Rainbow Six Siege, and it is probably the easiest game here to run as well. I set it to the low preset here as you're going to be wanting the most performance here in Rainbow Six Siege, and it got 256 FPS on average with a 1% low of 191 FPS. This is great for a 240Hz monitor experience because Siege is one of them games where nothing but frame rate matters, because Rainbow Six Siege is a very competitive game and you're going to be wanting as much frame rate as you can, so these settings on an RX 470 are totally perfect. For £50, the value of the RX 470 at this price point is unprecedented. This is some great value for a graphics card. Granted, not all of them go for around £50. You do have to wait and snipe a good deal. For £50, it is certainly doable. In all games, it performed relatively well, if I'm honest. Some games I did have to set to low, which is a big trend with newer games, if I'm honest. But even games like Battlefield 5, which is like notoriously hard to run, it ran just fine with 130 odd FPS on average. It was set to low, but Battlefield's that one game where the settings just do not scale very well at all. And maybe even if you have the 8GB version, you can set the settings to low in most games, but you can keep the textures on high, as 8GB of video memory is more than enough for 1080p in 2023. Thanks to upscaling innovations like AMD's FSR, thank you AMD so much for making it available on older cards like the RX 470. You can play games at kind of 1080p, but they are still playable at decent frame rates. Like, look at Cyberpunk. If we didn't have FSR for that game, it would have been a slideshow, but FSR did come in clutch quite a bit. 2023 will be a big year for the RX 470, with newer games like Forspoken coming out, only supporting DirectX 12.1 at a feature level. The RX 470 only supports DirectX 12.0 at a feature level, so newer games like Forspoken won't even start on this thing. Albeit Forspoken is not a good game. I haven't played it personally, but I haven't seen anything good about it, so yeah. But if this trend goes on, it's likely we'll see more and more games that won't be compatible with the RX 470. But if you're not interested in newer games and you're only interested in esports games, the RX 470 at 1080p, for £50, you can't beat this value. And if you've got a 144Hz monitor, esports games on this thing, really good experience. So can I recommend the RX 470 in 2023? And that is a yes, but with an asterisk as always. If you're into newer games, I'd say probably stay away for it, save up a bit more money and get something like a Radeon 6600 XT perhaps, because that is a much more powerful GPU. But then again, it's much more expensive, as it usually goes for around £200 here in the UK. But if you're just looking to play esports games at 1080p with 144Hz, the RX 470, you can't go wrong with it. For £50, I'd be more than happy with what I paid for this, because that is some incredible value. And with that being said, I'm going to leave the video here. So if you like this video, like it, stay subscribed for more GPU benchmarks, because I do have a few on the way, and I'll catch you in the next one.